Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. It's a beautiful day, isn't it? You're here to practice your English, aren't you? You've probably heard this type of question before in everyday conversations, and it's our topic for today, tag questions. So, number one, in what situations do you use a tag question? Well, you can use tag questions to make an exclamation or to encourage conversation with someone. So for example, it's a beautiful day, isn't it? That movie was fantastic, wasn't it? However, the majority of the time we use questions when you think you know something, but you want to double check that you are correct. So for example, your parents don't live here, do they? I think that your parents don't live here, but I want to check that I am correct. And I do that with a tag question, do they? Number two, how do you form a tag question? Well, first of all, a tag question is always after an affirmative or a negative sentence. You can never use a tag question with another question. And there are two elements to the tag question, a verb and a pronoun. For these two parts, for the actual tag question, there are a couple of things to take into consideration. Number one, for the pronoun, you simply repeat the same pronoun as the subject in the main sentence. So for example, your parents, they. We, you repeat the pronoun we. Your brother, he. Your mom, she, etc., etc., etc. In sentences with there is, there are, there was, and such, it is also possible to repeat the word there. So basically, your only options are he, she, it, we, you, they, I, and there. You cannot use a specific noun. So for example, you cannot repeat your mom or Anna or the book. It has to be a pronoun. However, I find that the most difficult part for students is identifying what verb or what auxiliary to use. And it is very simple, so there are just a couple of rules to take into consideration. So for example, if you look at the sentence and the sentence has an auxiliary verb, you simply repeat the auxiliary verb. However, if the sentence is negative, you repeat the same auxiliary but in the affirmative form. So if the main sentence is negative, you use an affirmative tag question, and if the sentence is affirmative, you use a negative tag question. So anyway, looking at sentence number one, your parents don't live. So you do have an auxiliary, you simply repeat the same auxiliary in the affirmative form. Your parents don't live here, do they? What other sentence contains an auxiliary verb? Number three, your brother can't swim. So can't is a modal auxiliary, it's an auxiliary. We simply repeat the same auxiliary, but in the affirmative form. So your brother can't swim, can he? Sentence number five also has an auxiliary. Your friend doesn't eat meat. So we simply repeat the same auxiliary, but in the affirmative form. Sentence number six has an auxiliary, you've seen. You've, of course, is a contraction of you have, and it is important that you be careful with this particular verb because have can be an auxiliary, but it can also be a regular verb, so you have to pay attention to which one it is in any particular sentence. One easy way to remember or identify if it's an auxiliary is that it's only an auxiliary if it combines with a past participle. So here we have, and then we have the past participle of seen, so it is an auxiliary. If it doesn't have a past participle with it, then it's not considered an auxiliary verb. Anyway, here, you've seen Titanic before. We simply repeat the auxiliary have, but in the negative form. So, you've seen Titanic before, haven't you? And sentence number 8 also has an auxiliary. You will come to my party. So we simply repeat this, but in the negative form. You will come to my party, won't you? One thing to take into consideration is that when we have a negative tag question, notice that we always use a contraction, doesn't, aren't, etc. We don't separate the auxiliary with the word not. So anyway, what happens if you don't have an auxiliary? Well, one thing that you should look for is the main verb. So if you don't have an auxiliary, but you notice that the main verb of the sentence is the verb to be, so is, are, was, were, then it is okay to repeat the verb to be in the tag question. And so this will only happen in the simple present and in the simple past, where the verb to be doesn't need an auxiliary to be grammatically correct. And we have a couple of examples where that's the case. Sentence number 2, we are late. Are in this particular sentence is not an auxiliary, but it's still the verb to be. So we repeat it in the tag question as well. So we are late, aren't we? We are late, aren't we? Sentence number 4 also has the verb to be as the main verb. So I am in classroom number 5. And so we're going to repeat this same verb, but in the negative form. Now, one thing to take into consideration is that am not doesn't have a contraction, and in tag questions we use contractions, so this is a special case. The tag question for I am basically is aren't. So I am in classroom number 5, aren't I? And if you have a tag question with the verb to be and the subject I, it's always going to be aren't I? And finally, we also have sentence number 9, which has the verb to be. So there was a test last week. We repeat the verb to be in the tag question in the negative form. And remember that we also repeat the word there when the sentence begins with there is, there was, there were, etc. So the tag question here is there was a test last week, wasn't there. Okay, so now you know what to do if you have an auxiliary verb, if the main sentence has an auxiliary verb, and you know what to do if the main verb in the sentence is the verb to be. But what happens if you don't have an auxiliary and you don't have the verb to be? Well, this is only going to happen in a couple of situations, the simple present and the simple past, and specifically affirmative sentences. We don't use an auxiliary verb typically in affirmative sentences in simple present or simple past. So for example, my mom lives, no auxiliary. I went, no auxiliary. But we do have an auxiliary verb associated with the simple present and the simple past. And in the simple present, it's do or does. And in the simple past, it's did. So basically, that's what we're going to use. And specifically, since I said it only happens in affirmative sentences that we don't have the auxiliary, it means that the tag question is always going to be negative. So don't, doesn't, and for simple past, didn't. And we have a couple of examples here where that's the case. Number 1, your mom usually drives to work. So again, you have the verb drives, but it doesn't have any type of auxiliary. Drives is simple present, so you're simply going to use a negative tag question. The auxiliary doesn't. So your mom usually drives to work, doesn't she? And the only other sentence we have where that's the case, it's number 10. You send the invitations. Sent in this particular sentence is in the simple past. So the auxiliary for the simple past in the negative form, didn't. You send the invitations, didn't you? And basically, that's how you use a tag question.